Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopoulos Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
So my name is Dan Rundy. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm a Senior Vice President here at CSIS. I'd like to welcome you today for our event on Sustainable Goal number 17, Partnerships for the Goals. SDG 17 aims to strengthen global partnerships to support and achieve the ambitious targets of the 2030 Agenda, bringing together governments, civil society, the private sector, and other actors. SDG 17 encompasses a wide range of target indicators, including encouraging developed countries to fully implement their ODA commitments, strengthening the concept of domestic resource mobilization, the whole series of related issues related to partnership. There are a total of 17 goals and 17 targets for this goal and 25 indicators for this goal. SDG 17 is an important goal because it is a reminder that closing the investment gap in developing countries can't be done with ODA or even public sector funding alone. It's going to require significant private sector investment. So if you don't get progress on SDG 17, the other 16 goals are going to be very difficult. We're going to have a discussion today about multi-stakeholder partnerships in the context of the SDGs, ways to think about private investment, how to think about new forms of finance, and the role of various stakeholders in making change happen. Thankfully, we've had many years of experience in the context of global development of public-private partnerships. Chevron, who's the sponsor of today's event, has been a leader on multi-stakeholder partnerships, and AID has been a leader on multi-stakeholder partnerships. So I'm really pleased that both Chevron and USAID are represented today. We've got several really interesting panelists. Mike Metzler, who's the Executive Director for the Private Sector Engagement Hub at USAID. We have my friend Heather Culp, who's a Manager for Strategy and Analytics at Chevron. My friend Greg Uger, who's the Executive Director of Think Huge, which you'll hear about when Greg speaks, really interesting organization. Then we have David McCauley, who's now a Senior Fellow for Sustainable Finance at the World Wildlife Fund. I'm going to turn it over to each panelist for some opening remarks to kick off our discussion. I'm going to first turn to Mike Metzler of AID. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks a lot to CSIS for the invite. It's obviously a topic very near and dear to our hearts at USAID. I could go in a bunch of different directions here, but maybe just in terms of opening framing remarks, we have been spending a lot of time under the direction of Administrator Power to really think through how do we live out the ambition that was set out in the agency's PSE policy, which came into effect a little over 2 years ago. And at the heart of that policy gets to the heart of what we have to do under SDG 17, which is scale our collective efforts. And scale is a word that's used quite often, probably misused in a lot of ways. But what the policy did for us is to really focus on how do we across the entire USAID platform scale our engagement with the private sector and do it in a more sustainable way, getting away from one-off interventions, one-off projects, but really think more holistically on engagement itself. And so we've been spending the last 2 years, especially with the launch of our PSE Hub, which was launched a year ago, to really dig into that and ask ourselves some tough questions on why hasn't scale occurred across the USAID platform after, depending on how you measure it, Dan, you helped launch the GDA office back 23 years ago. We've been doing it ever since, the DCA program and a lot of other great programs focused on private sector engagement. But why have we not seen scale take place across the platform? And our answer, frankly, is it's the platform itself. USAID as a platform was never initially built for this, and through a lot of really great work, I think over the years, very creative people have helped move it in that direction. But we have never fundamentally taken a look at USAID as a platform for private sector engagement. So the private sector engagement that has taken place, like Chevron's a great example, really great programming over the years with Chevron. And Heather may back me up on this. We hear it a lot. It's difficult. It's slow. It takes too much time. A lot of times our partners are not talking to the right folks within the agency. There's a lot to be done about USAID as a platform for growth for PSE. And so we are taking that on under this new administrator to really think through how do we dig into the DNA of the agency and look at critical systems that are frankly roadblocks to scaled interventions. And I'm happy to go into that. I won't go into it now, but I'm happy to dig into procurement systems. Our data systems need to be upgraded. Our relationship management systems need to be thought through and created anew. There are particular pain points that we've identified, our missions have identified, most importantly, our private sector partners have identified, that if we can adapt current agency systems in a fundamental and real way, we think that will unlock what we think exists in the agency, which is a real desire and interest to do this work. But we hear it all the time. Once somebody does one of these, engages in partnership, we hear about how difficult, time-consuming, bureaucratic the process was. And there's a lot we can do internally to fundamentally change that and put us on that pathway to scale. So that's something that we're working with the administrator on. Hope to be able to share a lot more information on that going forward. The administrator announced this in her speech November 4th at Georgetown and put a marker on critical bureaucratic reforms that really do need to take place. And then the only thing I mentioned just at the outset, there's a lot of great movement in the space beyond what USAID is working on. There is a really robust interagency discussion now based on a presidential memorandum that came out last year, and it has really sparked a full-throated discussion within the interagency led by the NSC that is directed toward all agencies and pushing us all toward thinking about how do we scale our partnerships and from our point of view, particularly with the private sector moving forward. So we're hoping to see a lot more movement across all agencies, not just USAID. So why don't I turn it back to you, but I'm happy to engage in any of that as we move forward.
Great, thanks, Mike. Heather, let me turn to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. And thanks, Mike, for those opening comments. Chevron understands that in order to empower people around the world to improve their lives and meet their full potential, you need everybody working together, right? And I think the SDGs is a really great example of both a framework for action and innovation. And because we have a whole SDG around partnerships, that the recognition that this is going to take everybody working together, right? And so I applaud what Mike was saying too about USAID taking a good look at kind of how to make partnerships a little bit more innovative. Funny story, I actually joined Chevron because I was one of the implementers of API and the Angola Partnership Initiative, which was one of the first public-private partnerships with USAID a long time ago. We're not going to date myself and give myself away around how long ago that was, but it was a great example, right, of something that was really innovative, where everybody brought their particular skills around a whole host of questions and problems and really made some great, strides forward on development goals in this case, the country of Angola. And I think it provides a really nice kind of framework for thinking about how do you now scale that upwards to all of these countries. I like the, Chevron really focuses, I think our work focuses and touches all 17 SDGs, but really we pay attention mostly to around 5 of them, in part because that's really where we feel like our area of expertise can lend some of that innovation, can lend some of that problem solving skills, and also can lend what we know about the individual countries that we've been deeply involved in some cases for decades and decades and decades. So we're really excited to host this conversation because, again, as Dan said, you don't get anywhere without partnership, right? These are complex problems. I was thinking earlier today as I was planning for this, maybe there were some easier problems a while ago, but if there were, they're solved, right? So we're left with the really hard stuff. And I think it's conversations like this that are really going to start to catalyze deep thinking about how do we get from A to C without skipping B, right? And I think that's one of these, the strength of conversations like this. So I really look forward to hearing from my panelists. And thanks again, Dan, for setting this all up.
Thanks. Greg, I'm so glad you're able to join us. I hope you might just share a little bit about Think Huge, because I think it's an organization that may not be as well known to folks that are on this call that may know are familiar with AID and with Chevron or WWF. I think it's a really interesting organization. You bring a lot of experience. You were at John Deere, you were at Unocal, you were at Bechtel, you worked at AID, and now you've been convening this private sector group focused on Central America. Thanks for being here, Greg.
Well, Dan, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you, CSIS, for the opportunity to participate. I'm the executive director of Think Huge Business and Investment Council. Huge is from Honduras, USA, Guatemala, and El Salvador. It was formed about a year ago by a group of leading business people from the 4 countries. And the intention was and is to facilitate and make private investment in businesses that will create jobs in the 4 countries, and very importantly, in the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, in linked in with the United States. And the group realizes that that is one of the ways to help deal with one of the problems that the 4 countries face, and that is that life for the common people in the Northern Triangle is often so difficult that they have no other choice but to flee and come to the United States, which is for them a very difficult transition and poses challenges for the United States in receiving them and for their countries in losing them. And so they are doing it, we are doing it with that in mind, and realizing that just having a job and getting a salary is not enough. People who just have a job and a salary but are living miserably in difficult communities where their kids can't be safe and they can't walk down the street, just have really enough money to pay the coyote to get them all up to the United States. So the group understands that benefits from the job, health, education, safety, environmental integrity, all those things lead to sustainable communities, and ones that are in a position to be attractive to people to find their American dream at home in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, and not have to come here looking for it. So that's Think Huge. And I have personally, as Dan said, I was many years in the private sector with the 3 companies he mentioned, and the tip of the hat to Heather and Chevron, which absorbed Unocal as I left. So I would just make one point about the impact of U.S. Development assistance and involvement in all kinds of environments, from red, which is chaotic and war, through green, which is peace on the commons. And the special forces are the tip of the spear there. They do good work in communities and go in and stay for years. The civil affairs of the military come in after them. OTI at USAID follows them and helps build on what they're doing in stabilizing the communities. Big USAID follows the OTI USAID in making things stable plus, and very importantly, helping the countries that want to do it meet the conditions that are required by the Millennium Challenge Corporation to get large grants from the United States to do important infrastructure and other projects, which are really fundamentally important building blocks. And all of that leads to the opportunity for the private sector, with great involvement for the Development Finance Corporation, to invest and take it into a future where it's all done by private sector, which is really where the money is. So I am a great believer in the synergy and the partnerships that we're talking about here to achieve the order of magnitude to meet the challenges of the goal. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. David, when I think about multi-stakeholder partnerships, I think about the fact that there is an important role for civil society and NGOs like the World Wildlife Fund. And I think a lot of the kinds of some multi-stakeholder partnerships are oftentimes put together by organizations like yours. You guys are conveners. Sometimes it's a donor like AID, sometimes it's a company like Chevron, but sometimes it's WWF, where you're bringing together various stakeholders. Thanks for being here.
Hear me okay? I hope so.
Yes.
Yeah, so I'll just say a few words up front because I'm sure it's better to leave time for the give and take, and I can give more specific examples later. But apart from that brokering role and facilitation role where partnerships are so central to our work, we couple that, of course, with our work on advocacy, using the power of our brand and our presence in more than 100 countries and 7,000 people around the world. I work out of the US office in Washington, which is itself about 500. So we've got the depth of experience and expertise. A lot of the partnership work we do is around knowledge partnerships, tied especially to policy change. And as you can well imagine, our focus tends to be on issues related to nature, climate, agriculture sector as it relates to those two, for example, but also spills over into cities work, and the climate resiliency work gets you into all sorts of aspects of both maintaining and restoring healthy ecosystems for their wide range of benefits. And we find that there is such a growing demand for partnering in these areas, from the business sector, from the finance sectors, fellow NGOs, from the philanthropic sector, and mostly not so much with private finance, although we are getting into that more, but more with philanthropic funding. We're finding that we're really getting into the blended finance space in a big way and helping to encourage major philanthropic pledges like the $5 billion for nature and climate that was pledged during the last UNGA meeting in September in New York, and working with partners, new partners, literally new partners like the Bezos Earth Fund. So there's a lot more that can be said there, and I look forward to the conversation. There are a wide range of different types of partnerships, whether they're, like Mike said, trying to get to the scale that's required of impact, which is tough. But we do know that public funding alone won't do it. It really requires mobilizing private finance at scale. So that's the big challenge. And also, I agree, we're dealing with really hard stuff here. That's what's left for this decade, the decisive decade for nature and climate. And we'll come back to those. So it's a pleasure to be here and look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, David. Mike, you've had an interesting career in the public sector. You've looked at different forms of finance. Could you talk about the different forms of funding, whether it's blended finance or sharing risk or traditional ODA? How do you all think about that at AID?
Sorry. You're right, Dan. A lot of my career has been spent thinking about and watching the evolution of what is now broadly referred to as blended finance. But the reality is we've been doing that for a long period of time. There's just a lot more outside folks involved in that, which is great because you see the real markets move. I mean, all across private sector engagement, I think one of our starting points as we look at that is like, start with the markets themselves, right? Start with the consumers in the markets that we're dealing with. Stop looking at beneficiaries as beneficiaries alone, but they actually form a marketplace. They're consumers, they're savers, they're laborers. And the private sector has seen those opportunities, certainly more, I would say, in the last 10 to 15 years than ever before. And so the landscape, not just in finance itself, but also in just corporate engagement and penetration in the markets that they have traditionally not been in, certainly at the scale they are now, has really forced the agency to rethink its approach to this. And again, getting back to scale, one of the ways you scale your programming is find partners that are already scaled and doing it. And that, with our new policy that came in 2 years ago, that was really the kind of the pivot that the agency took in terms of the way it looks at private sector engagement. Find the partners that are already in these markets and help them do more of what they're doing, because if you do that, you have a better shot at a long-term sustainable development impact than if you just start up yet another programming that is all aid funded and aid driven, right? And so it really challenged the agency across all programming to take a different look at this and really start with the partnership first, multi-stakeholder partnerships in particular, focused on either a geographic approach, like Greg had talked about a bit earlier, or maybe it's on a specific development problem like COVID response right now or climate, and then galvanizing partners that are really trying to enter that space or are already in that space. And just in terms of finance, I mean, finance is a good example of that. When I started my career working in the old DCA office, when the office was fairly small and really focused on mobilizing local bank finance. And it did a great job of doing that, but it was bank by bank, country by country. It was very small. And we put a lot of thought into how do you take advantage of this real interest, especially after ODA, about scaling private sector engagement, finance.
Sorry, Mike, what's ODA for our listeners at home?
Right. So when they were forming the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a meeting in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia where they focused on financing for development. In fact, the numbers that you hear a lot about, the need to finance the goals, came out of those meetings in terms of what is needed to finance each of the goals, and it led to, I think it was the $2.6 trillion cost for all of them. And a lot of that focus talked about, and I think a lot of talk about blended finance kind of came out of those discussions, but really focusing on who are the new market actors that are moving into this space beyond the local market actors, which is we were focused on, and particularly the ones that could scale it, like pension funds and other institutional investors. How do we engage them? They're moving into these markets. How do we accelerate that movement? Because the more they move into those markets, the more we could scale. And it was also looking at different financing mechanisms beyond what we were using, which were guarantees, loans. You know, the launch of the DFC brought in a new product in terms of U.S. government investment, which is equity, which holds tremendous potential to really scale what the U.S. government is able to do, USAID as well, through the DFC. They're still working out the details of what that looks like. There's some issues there in terms of costing, but I think that was a recognition. The launch of the DFC itself was a recognition that we really got to approach this problem in the space a bit differently, but most importantly, take advantage of what's happening in the markets themselves. We don't have to drive the markets into more investment into these countries and the communities and these problems. We just got to make sure we are there to influence it as much as we can as it scales naturally.
Heather, could you talk about some of Chevron's partnerships initiatives around the world? You're oftentimes the largest taxpayer in a number of countries. You're oftentimes one of the largest investors in many developing countries. You're oftentimes there for decades. And you also seek to develop a local workforce and bring global standards to your work, but also you want to also have good relations with the community. So I'd really be curious if you could share a little bit about some of your partnerships.
Sure, thanks. I'd be happy to, Dan. Yeah, I mean, basically, we're a company that needs to have, stability, an educated workforce, and consumers in the places that we work, right? I mean, let's be honest, I think recognizing the self-interest that is inherent in partnerships is actually sometimes an underdeveloped incentive for these partnerships, right? And so we're really open about that, right? Like, we need those things in order to prosper in the countries that we work in. And that's why, as Dan said, we have invested in partnerships like this around the world. And so I think I mentioned API, which was kind of our first large scale one, but I think the one that I know the best, because I spent many years working on it, is the Niger Delta Partnership Initiative, which is also a partnership with USAID, as well as a bunch of other local and international donors and other private sector partners. This is a partnership that really was looking at how do you address some of the conflict and economic issues in what has traditionally been considered one of the harder regions to really get sustainable development in, which is the Niger Delta in Nigeria. And through partnerships, which is bringing together USAID folks, it's also bringing together agriculture, private sector folks. It's bringing together aspects of the Nigerian government, right? Because we really believe that you're not going to get sustainable solutions unless you include the government, right? It's just got to be an essential partner. And it's one of the reasons we really like the SDGs, because I think it gives us a framework to have some of these conversations with our government partners in a really sustainable way, right? When we all talk about SDG 8, we know what we're talking about and kind of can start to have that as a framework. But going back to NDPI, this was really looking at how do we catalyze sectors that will produce jobs, right? The oil and gas industry is a capital intensive industry. It's not a job intensive industry. So recognizing that, what was a job intensive industry? Agriculture, that had a lot of growth potential. And so by working with partners like USAID, like with DFID, we've been able to actually create over 55,000 new jobs across the Niger Delta in agriculture, not just agriculture though, construction and IT. So it's not just, maybe it's looking forward into the future too, and trying to figure out ways to catalyze new industries in places where there's a skill set for it, right? And certainly in Nigeria, there's an excellent IT skill set that we've been able to harness. And we've also been able to catalyze over 600 development projects across the Niger Delta in partnership with the communities and owned by the communities that they're going to that benefit from the partner, right? I think when we talk about partnerships of the SDGs, we often talk about private sector, we talk about USAID, we talk about the national or state government. But I always say too, an essential partner to all of this is going to be the local communities. And how do we bring a framework like the SDGs down to their local communities? And so it's around how do we provide opportunities for growth? How do we recognize and how do we catalyze growth and jobs that are really going to transform economically a place? And how do we tie that into some of the conditions that are creating conflict, right? So in the Niger Delta, there is conflict that is around lack of opportunity, lack of economic opportunity. It's not the only reason, but it's certainly one of the drivers. And so how do we harness some of our economic skills to also drive some peace and security, so that it really becomes much more looking at how do we drive multiple SDGs and how do we understand the intersectionality of those, and then try to find innovative solutions that lie in that sort of Venn diagram between multiple SDGs in an area. So I think that's what's really exciting to me. And it's looking at ways that we can learn from our partners like USAID as they're moving forward. And I really applaud, we were very excited about, the new financing opportunities, the equity investments, just recognizing that that's just a tool that's going to help the US government invest in new ways, which is really exciting. And so again, it's innovation. If I could kind of say, it's partnership, and it's partnership for innovation, because that's what it's going to take to really get at some of these more thorny questions. But I think in a place like the Niger Delta, we've shown that you can create solutions even in places where, let's be frank, a lot of people said it couldn't be done. So to me, the SDGs provide that framework to have those conversations, to start and to really say, okay, where can we create some innovative solutions? Where do we recognize where there are multiple problems working together, and how do we find solutions that kind of get at all of those problems in an integrated way?
Thank you, Heather. Greg, I was particularly enthused about including you in this because I think when I think about the challenges of Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, there's going to be only so much foreign assistance that the U.S. or others can provide, but ultimately it's about the best. Many folks, if they're going to decide whether they're going to migrate or not, are going to depend on whether they're employed locally in one of those countries if they've got a job. So that requires private investment. Some of that investment is going to come from multinational companies like Chevron, and a lot of that employment is also going to come from the local private sector in these three countries who are there for the long term. And to the extent that there's a sense that they have a sense of security about their investments, or a sense of confidence that they can invest, they'll invest more, and that means more jobs for more people. And so I think I thought it was particularly interesting that Think Huge was put together in the last year, given sort of the increased recognition that we need all the stakeholders, including the local private sector, in many of these contexts, including in Central America.
Well, Dan, let me comment a little bit about the Think Huge, a little more detail. But as Heather just said, the companies that made up and make up Think Huge are looking for the same things that Chevron's looking for: stability, educated workforce, consumers that have buying power, and I would add the rule of law, which is a very important fundamental basis. Now, so far, the members of the Think Huge, which are now 17 going to 30, have in the first year are doing 9 investment projects for a total of $1.88 billion to create about 160,000 jobs. And they are reaching out to civil society. They're reaching out to other companies that have complementary capabilities. We're working with development agencies. We're working with multilaterals. They're doing blended financing. They're doing very creative democratization of financing. And so these are businesses from the 4 countries, and I would include the United States importantly in that. Companies that have been working in the Northern Triangle for a very long time. And they know that they can operate according to global standards because they are and they have been. And they are doing things that create a sustainable, good life for the people around them, the employees, their communities in particular. Let me give you a few examples of some of those partnerships that exist or that we're building. We've had a nice growing relationship with USAID through Michael Camilleri, who's the head of the AID Northern Triangle Task Force. And there we're looking at workforce development as a good opportunity for us to collaborate. Our companies are growing. Our new investors are building new factories, farms, energy plants, they need a trained workforce, as Heather was pointing out. And so we're looking at what kinds of, how many people with what skills we're going to need to employ over the next few years as we go from where we are now at pushing 2 billion in investment and 160,000 jobs to our goal over 5 years is 10 billion in investment and 2 million jobs. So who are these people and how are they going to hire them? Well, one thing, they can't bring them back from the United States. If they're gone, they're gone. So the companies letting AID know and AID's implementing partners know how many of what skill set people we want to hire over the next few years. Then we can work together on that training, so to produce that workforce. I think that's very exciting and good opportunity. I had been involved with programs like that in some of my AID assignments, and I think this is really appropriate. Another one, a company, Elcatex, that has industrial parks. They got 8 million square feet in now, and they're building another one for 4 million square feet. And they employ 55,000 people. They have put together with local officials, local bank, and some technical help, a housing program to provide decent housing through providing funding for mortgages for the kind of people that work in the industrial parks. And so in one park, for example, they built over 4,500 very nice houses in very safe communities with good education, health, etc. So they're also, another example is that they're working with the Inter-American Development Bank, which is a very good partner for us, We Connect, and Fundis, which is a local Honduran foundation, to increase the role of women small businesses in their supply chain by 25% over the next few years, and to increase their purchases by 40% from those companies. Another example is IDC, which is a investment company in Guatemala, who's one of our founders, and they're working in a public-private partnership that turned into a private because the parliament has not yet approved the public part. So they're doing a road for $160 million, and they've opened up to anyone in Honduras through the stock exchange shares in the investment fund that would make up that 160 million. And they've gotten some funding, $400,000, I believe it was, from AID through one of its implementing partners to do work with people in the area, the right-of-way area where the highway will go, so as to bring them in as potential as shareholders and ones who receive an annual royalty. So that's an example of an AID cooperation. I don't think we have time to go on and on about this. I could tell you more. Just give me a couple of other examples. One is Ficosa, which is a very large bank and insurance finance company in Honduras that works throughout the region. So they have a $600 million portfolio working with multilateral banks to support financial inclusion and the development of small and medium enterprises. And they're putting together a gender-based fund for $70 million with other development finance organizations. And finally, yesterday we had the first meeting of a new part of HUGE, which it doesn't have yet its real name, but it's an advisory council of civil society entities within to provide advice to HUGE it's our founders and our investors as we move forward with our plans to make sure that the projects are structured themselves for environmental, social sustainability, and that they are thinking outside the box on all aspects of corporate responsibility. So that will be an important advisory group working within Huge, and it'll have external universities, NGOs, government agencies like USAID perhaps, and other players to help us be on the cutting edge as we make these $10 billion of investment over the next 5 years to create opportunity for people in the Northern Triangle and the United States, and help achieve a very important part of the overall sustainable development mission. Thank you.
Great, thank you. David, thank you for being here. And you've had a lot of experience working at the intersection of the public and private financing. We've got big challenges, as you were saying earlier. Could you talk a little bit about what you see as the biggest challenges, but also some of the biggest opportunities from where you sit at WWF over the next 5 to 10 years and where partnerships might fit into those?
Sure. And, there won't be time to go into a lot of examples, but we do a lot of work also on sort of trying to shape the systemic change that's necessary to sort of frame up the environment for these kinds of investments. And I encourage anyone that's interested to go to panda.org/finance, and you'll see our work in this sector. I would say that there are certainly many innovative finance opportunities that are out there, driven by the demand that we've all alluded to before. But they do need sort of this enabling frame. So, we've been working with the formation of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is kind of a follow-on to the similar one that was done on climate disclosure. And Janet Yellen is sort of picking up on that now. And it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in terms of the US financial regulations. We've been working on standards for sustainable infrastructure. I think that with the COVID response and the efforts to stimulate economies, most of that comes to infrastructure investments because they're quick to create jobs, as was alluded to as a necessity. And so I think that we've been working with Guggenheim Partners on that to help move more towards common understanding rather than this proliferation of standards, sort of moving towards a common set of standards, because big institutional investors like the pension funds and insurance companies and sovereign wealth funds, they want a bigger portion of their portfolios associated with sustainable investments, but there's lots of room for greenwash. There's lots of room for confusion, frankly, even benign confusion. And I think that this space on standards is important. We've also helped create the Leaders Pledge for Nature, which is more than 100 countries who are pushing forward now. A lot that's tied to multilateral agreements. I think that the SDGs, when they were created, and SDG 17 around means of implementation, was very much thinking about the Climate Convention and the Biodiversity Convention and others, and ways of mobilizing financial resources and partnerships around those. Actions, I should just briefly talk about some actions because I think they give a taste, Dan, of the kinds of things that can go forward. We've recently done one with Hewlett Packard, $80 million, and where they've gone beyond their scope 1, 2, 3 commitments on climate to ensure that even every page of paper that runs through any printer that they've built is going to be neutralized through investments in forest ecosystems. We've been working, as I mentioned, with Bezos Earth Fund and with other philanthropic partners to help build up an approach for simultaneously going after climate benefits as well as biodiversity benefits for forest ecosystems in places like Bhutan and Colombia and Peru. We've been working with Asian Development Bank on healthy oceans. I was a decade at Asian Development Bank before joining WWF, so working with my former colleagues there. By the way, I did also work at and with USAID for more than 10 years a while ago. I won't date myself either, but it was a while back. And but it's good to see these kinds of partnerships. That's a $5 billion commitment from Asian Development Bank. So I think all of these show that the sort of combination of multilateral institutions together with bilateral aid programs, national government reforms to get after the domestic resource mobilization that you mentioned at the outset, Dan, and moving away from subsidies for the fossil fuel industry and others who are at the root of some of the problems that we have, and moving more towards platforms like this Goal 17 partners that we've been a partner with UN Partnerships Office on, and also with Guggenheim. So I think that, and climate bonds, green bonds, we need all of that capital to come to the table, and very quickly, because we have less than a decade. Thanks.
Thank you. This is great. I'm listening. I'm hearing a number of interesting things from this conversation. One of the important things with the SDG is applying a common language across sectors. I think it's something Heather referenced. One of the things that has struck me about the SDGs is how quickly they were adopted by global companies. And it's been an important way to talk across companies, across sectors, and having a common language. I also think one of the things I'm taking away from what David was saying was this issue of a common set of standards. I think this continues to be an ongoing challenge about what counts and what doesn't count. These sorts of issues so sometimes they get in kind of eye-glazing detail, but are really, really important. So standard setting and setting standards and common sets of standards are really important depending on what the challenge that we're talking about. I also, I'm taking away about this issue of thinking about platforms and networks. I think the digital world allows us for even more accelerated and more rapid networking, and the creation of virtual platforms that allow for greater action across sectors. Finally, one of the things that I'm also taking away from this is the innovations in finance. When I got started in this business a long time ago, and I'm reluctant to date myself too, a lot of the things I'm going to just reference, some buzzwords that you hear now, you didn't hear as often. You didn't hear about, you didn't hear that much about the role of pension funds. It was just beginning to be kind of talked about. You certainly didn't hear much about sovereign wealth funds. You didn't hear much about things like green finance or climate bonds. You hear a lot more about that now. You certainly heard a lot about CSR, but you now hear a lot more about ESG. And I'd actually be curious a little bit if someone wants to comment on sort of the evolution of ESG and how that's driving some thinking in companies or in development. Maybe Heather, I might just ask you to, if you reflect on that, or David, if I say the word ESG, how's that come across your radar screen at Chevron? I know it's a big part of what you do every day, but I'd be curious about that. Or David, if you wanted to comment on the evolution from CSR to ESG, I'd be curious about that. So, but maybe Heather, I don't know if you want to comment on this.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I was never a big fan of CSR anyway, as a term. I felt like, Dan, you've heard me say this before, events, I always felt like it got to the point where, everything was CSR and nothing was CSR. And I will say we'll have to make sure that ESG doesn't go the same way, right? But again, I think where ESG, when tied to the SDGs, to go back to your point, it gives you a framework, right? So if you can start to think through some of these very complicated problems, recognizing that we have to come up with near-term, medium-term, and long-term solutions, right? how do you talk about that? And again, that's why I think the SDGs provide you a way to kind of link up some of those languages and some of that conversation, because you do start to think about these knotty, complicated problems, none of which have easy solutions, none of which any of us can solve alone. And so how do you say as a company, okay, so on the social front, here's some of the things that we're investing in, here's some of the things that we're thinking about. Let's find some partners that are going to help us get to the next level, right, on some of these questions. So I guess I would say kind of connecting the ESG movement to the SDG movement, where I like that overlap, right? Because again, it gives you that framework to have these conversations across sectors and to be able to kind of say, this is what we're talking about collectively. That said, I will also say we have a long way to go in terms of standards, in terms of really definitions sometimes. And I think that does provide some problems. I would also say, though, that I don't want definitions and standards to get in the way of progress, right? So yep. I think that's one piece too.
Yep.
Right?
Great. David, you must, if I said you ESG, I'm sure it's been banging up against your radar screen every day for at least a half a decade.
Yeah, it's true. But I think Heather's comment about CSR is very astute. It became sort of a way of dealing with a set of issues that were not so much material and tied to the bottom line, and sort of a nice to haves, and engagement with other partners like CSOs and other companies. And I think that ESG, because it is tied to the financing by definition, I think has a sharper edge to it. I agree that there's a risk there, Heather, that it could go the same direction. And so it's important that we sort of tease out the elements. And there's been a lot of work done on that lately. But what's happened is that climate has really sort of taken over the ESG space, and to its detriment to a certain extent. And, WWF spends a lot of time trying to elevate attention to the loss of nature and nature positive and biodiversity loss and so forth as two sides of the same coin with the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis and so forth. But the reality is that so many companies went to their boards with first the 2 degrees, now they're reluctant, but having to go back with 1.5 degrees sort of strategies. And they built around the CSR, merged into ESG and into the climate consciousness and pledges and commitments all at about the same time. So the structures and the staffing that you see, and even if they're still called CSR units in companies, now are very much dominated by attention to climate. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but what it means is those that are working on the social issues or on the nature issues, which we tend to focus on more, have to accept that you need to fit within that structure. Even within government, if you look at the way the Treasury Department is going about dealing with climate and thinking about nature, and it's as an add-on to climate. And that's why at COP26, nature-based solutions for climate and this whole nature-based solution space has taken off so much, because it's got such broad appeal across all of these different areas. I don't know if that answers your question, Dan.
No, that's actually quite helpful. Mike, let me come back to you. You started at the beginning making some comments about some of the critical systems that you're thinking about. Getting folks to be able to work across sectors remains a challenge. You referenced procurement and data, relationship management systems. Could you talk a little bit about some of the hopes that you have for progress over the next while on some of these systems, or some of the things that you're working on at AID?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Just real quick though, just in the last, I'm really glad you brought up ESG. Like Heather said, I think it provides a better framework for talking across from governments to NGOs to business in a better way than CSR provided, but it can't be the end all be all. But it does, like the SDGs themselves, create a way to talk more. At the end of the day, though, I really like what Heather and Greg had to say about, and this is what the agency's trying to think more. Making profit is not only good, it's necessary to push to get sustainability in these different areas. So when you hear a company talk about, I need an educated workforce, we need to work on housing, we need to work on education, they might as well be in the development space, because they are in the development space for those reasons, for different reasons. And the more we can bridge that gap, the better we can push changes. But real quick to your question on USAID, yeah, I'll give you a real quick example that I think is easily accessible. HR systems. We've been working on private sector engagement for a very long time. We are still very bad at bringing in people with any private sector background, particularly people with significant private sector background. We just did a quick back of the envelope view, because there's no systems to capture this it doesn't capture what our profile looks like in terms of folks with private sector. But we took a look at the last 10 foreign service officer classes that have come in the agency over about the last 4 or 5 years. And we took a look at all the resumes and found, we asked the simple question, any private sector experience, and found 76% didn't have any. And of the 24, my guess is probably 1, probably 2, probably 3 years. If you think about significant private sector experience, that number will go way down. That's a problem, right? If the future of development is enterprise driven and we need to scale, we need a better balance in terms of the people we recruit into we need to bring that experience that will accelerate change in this area. So we just need to adapt the systems, not create new systems, but adapt current systems to do a much better job, and then see how we're doing over time, numbers of folks coming in with that background.
Look, we can't solve any of these problems. I'm just going to list some of them. Closing the digital divide, meeting global infrastructure needs, meeting global energy, meeting the climate challenge, feeding 9 billion people, countering disinformation, fighting trafficking in persons, meeting the youth bulge, and creating a demographic dividend and workforce development. These are just some of the things that are in the global inbox. These are all really hard challenges. Forced migration. These are all multi-stakeholder challenges. They're complex, that are not going to be solved in 20 minutes. We have to take a 5, 10, or 15-year timeline to these challenges. Working across sectors is challenging. I think the SDGs provide a step in providing a common language and providing some common goals. And so I think that helps. And we've just got to keep at it. We've made some global progress. We're going to have to do more. I think the disruption of COVID makes some challenges even more intense. One of which is the digital issue. I think we talk about a digital transformation. We've been digitally transformed. And so, and the digital divide that we've seen, whether it's in rural Maryland, Mali, Moldova, or Malaysia, is going to get closed. And it's going to require a multi-stakeholder approach. This has been great. I want to thank all of the panelists for joining me today. I want to thank my friends at Chevron for helping sponsor this series. I think this is we've done about 12 of these of the SDGs. I'm really grateful, Heather, to Chevron and your long-term partnership with us. We couldn't do the things we do at CSIS without partners like Chevron. So we're really grateful. Thanks to the speakers. Thank you all for paying attention today, and we'll be in touch. Hope to see you in person all soon. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for hosting.